As Company Y entered Kokumbona, the Japanese withdrew to the brush. The Marines recorded 65 enemy killed during the clash. Company L had 4 men killed and 11 wounded, and Company 1 lost 1. Licking their wounds, the Japanese retreated to the hills with all their weapons. They would have more use for them when they made their next stand at the bank of the Mboneke River. They had a considerable number of wounded, as Sankichi Kaneda records. When it was dark, the unarmed construction workers, commanded by Commissioned Officer Lieutenant Seda Masao Tsunomura, engineering officer at Koku Kichi RXI, the air base on Guadalcanal, at their head, moved out in the moonlight into the grass and trees. After them came the ambulatory sick and wounded, leaning on a cane or another shoulder. Next were the heavy-laden litter-bearers, carrying 50 patients, and the landing force men set out from the third camp area, Sigillo Camp, carrying weapons ready for an enemy pursuit. Marine headquarters ordered the companies back to the perimeter. Companies 1 and L returned by boat, while Company B marched to Kukum via the beach route. Radio man Kuichi Yamada of the 8th Communication Unit reported that the 11th CU then had a strength of 428 and the 13th CU had 850. The Japanese felt a special urgency to have a lightning attack unit drive the Americans from Guadalcanal. The force selected for the task was Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's crack 28th Infantry Regiment, the Ichiki Detachment, which was then at Truk. Its original task had been to assault Midway Island, but because the Imperial Navy had made a misstep there in June at the Battle of Midway and suffered losses, the detachment was at Truk pending transfer to Japan. The day after arriving at Truk, Colonel Ichiki received an order from the 17th Army. Ichiki Detachment, with cooperation from the Navy, will recapture RXI, Guadalcanal Airfield. They are to seize without delay a position on RXN, Guadalcanal, where they will await the arrival of their backup unit. As a vanguard, they will board 6 destroyers and leave for RXN immediately. At 2300 on the 18th of August, the advance echelon of 916 men were delivered by 6 ships of Destroyer Division 14, the Arashi, 1st Lieutenant Hideo Goto, Engineers and Headquarters, the Hagikaze, 1st Lieutenant Magoz Marama, 3rd Company, the Hamikaze, 1st Lieutenant Shigenao Komatsu, 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry Regiment Machine Gun Company, the Tanikaze, Major Nobuo Kuramoto, 4th Company, the Kagero, 1st Lieutenant Yusaku Higuchi, 1st Company, and the Urakaze, Captain Tetsuro Sawada, 2nd Company. The U.S. military had named these destroyer transports the Tokyo Express, though subsequently the Cactus Airmen would call them the Rat Patrol, as they transported Japanese forces to Guadalcanal under the cover of night, essentially unopposed. The Japanese troops, most ex-China veterans comprising the 1st Battalion, 28th Infantry Regiment, were under Major Kuramoto. The formation landed at the 81st Guard Unit Naval Lookout Post at Tiabo Misaki, Taivu Point, under PO-3 Sitan. Earlier, also at Taivu, an echelon of the Express dropped off 160 men from the 3rd Company, 1st Independent Shipping Engineer Regiment, under Captain Masaharu Mushitan. These soldiers operated the Shothatsu, small landing craft, and Daihatsu, large landing barge, and would ferry the detachment to shore. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki was an impatient officer, and within hours after his force had landed, a reconnaissance patrol was organized to scout the attack route. He believed the report that only 2,000 Americans were on the island, and his strategy was to be a surprise night attack. He had boasted that the Americans would lose. Ichiki met with Major Kuramoto and planned the assault, based on the forthcoming results of an intelligence-gathering party. A 38-man party was put together consisting of 5 teams. It was led by Captain Yoshimi Shibuya, the communication officer, and included 4 other officers, 1st Lieutenant Shoji Tate, 2nd Lieutenant Masanobu Hagyuda, 2nd Lieutenant Kenji Matsumoto, and an engineer, Provisional Officer Shigemi Wada. 2 enlisted sailors from the 81st Guard Unit were to act as guides. The patrol set out at 0830 on the 19th of August, taking the sandy coastal route to familiarize the men with the terrain and the point of attack. At 1200, the men stopped for a rest and lunch at Korimura, Koli village, a little off the route. At 1307, they were on the move again. The two guides were in the lead. Captain Shibuya's team, with Lieutenant Tate on his left, was about 100 feet behind them. In the middle were Lieutenant Hagyuda's men, followed by Lieutenant Matsumoto and his group. Provisional Officer Wada and his fifth team brought up the rear. At the bend in the road at Korisaki, Koli Point, they ran into an ambush laid by a patrol from Company A, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, under Captain Charles H. Brush, Jr. His 60-man force was equipped with automatic weapons, and guiding the patrol were four of Martin Clemens's scouts, Daniel Poole, Beato, Gumu, and Vura. Daniel and Vura were with Captain Brush. Beato and Guma were with 2nd Lieutenant John J. Jakim. Shibuya, Tate, and the guides were killed instantly. Others took cover, but they faced a hail of gunfire. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Jakim steered his platoon around the right flank in an enveloping movement to cut off the enemy's rear. Jakim recalls, "We came across the Japanese quite suddenly. They were all cleverly camouflaged and hard to see until they seemed to pop out of the bush only yards away. It was horribly frightening, uncertain, and confused. They seemed to be all around. I just fired furiously whenever one came into view." In the 51-minute skirmish, 32 Japanese were killed, including all 5 of the officers. Most died immediately, except Engineer Wada, who, though severely wounded, managed to escape into a thicket. He died there afterward. Another wounded man, Supplanter Kiyonobu Akasaka of the 1st Squad, Tate Platoon, also crawled into the underbrush. Sergeant Sudo, despite his severe wounds, was able to return to Taivu Point to give a report, then collapsed and died. Superior Privates Hirano and Isamu Mashiko, both slightly wounded, were slowly making their way back to Taivu. Leading Pursuit Masamitsu Okamo and PFC Katajiro Tomano, also wounded, returned to their base and reported the disaster. On hearing the news, Colonel Ichiki was stunned. How could this happen? A relief party from the 1st Company, led by 1st Lieutenant Yusaku Higuchi, was immediately assembled and rushed to the scene. The group included a medical team under 1st Lieutenant Giji Nakai. Lieutenant Higuchi and his platoon took the lead. Some 325 feet behind, the 2nd Platoon, under 2nd Lieutenant Yuzo Kudo, kept a close watch for the Americans. The 3rd Platoon, under 2nd Lieutenant Tadayoshi Uchizawa, protected the rear. Accompanying Higuchi's men was the 1st Platoon, 4th Company, under 2nd Lieutenant Kiyoshi Sato. The patrol arrived at 2000 to find that the Americans were gone and that bodies and blood were spread all across the area. In the faint evening light, they found 5 dead Marines wrapped in tarps and apparently ready for interment. One by one, the men of the patrol located their comrades in the jungle. All had been killed except Corporal Akasaka, who was breathing but unconscious. Members of Lieutenant Sato's platoon buried their dead. Before the Japanese had arrived, however, 2nd Lieutenant John J. Jakim's platoon had searched the bodies of the Japanese for information. Emptying the pockets of the dead, they found notes, photographs, and in some cases, badges. One key discovery was a dispatch case, which revealed evidence of a recently arrived strong army force, including an aerial photograph showing the layout of the Marines' camp. These men were not sailors. They were first-class Japanese army troops, the first of their breed on the island. The 1st Marines would soon meet the rest of the newcomers at the ILU River Basin. Back on Espiritu Santo, the message was received to send an air service support unit to Guadalcanal, the airplane specialists. The only men available were the Blue Jackets of CUB-1, and thus it was that 120 sailors were hauled out of their beds at midnight and given a handful of M1903.30 caliber Springfield rifles. The echelon was commanded by ENs, George Washington Wash Polk, USNR, assisted by WO Robert Fickles, USN. They were accompanied by an older flying officer, Major Charles H. Fogg Hayes, USMC, Executive Officer of VMO 251, Vice ADM John S. McCain, Commander Air South Pacific, Commercipac, had ordered Major Hayes to go to Guadalcanal to get the airstrip prepared to receive aircraft. Hayes would play a key role in the completion and operation of the field and would be the first operations officer. The men of CUB-1 were herded aboard the same converted four-stackers of Transport Division 12 that had taken the first raiders to Tulagi on 7 August, the Colquhoun, Gregory, Little and McKean. Nestled on the decks of the refitted tin cans were 455-gallon drums of avgas, drums of aviation oil, 282 bombs, 100 to 500-pounders, several hand pumps, various boxed belts of ammunition, and a few aircraft tools. The green Cub-1 sailors reached Guadalcanal at sunset on the 15th of August. There they were unceremoniously dumped onto the unlit, squashy beach and introduced to the basic facts of their new life of foxholes and mud in a hot, mucky hellhole of disease, bombing, and assured misery. The Cub-1 specialists included ordnance men, gas crews, mechanics, a parachute rigger, medics, and a postal clerk. Metalsmith PO3, C. Louis Fuller said, "We had 4 master toolboxes, period. That is all we had to work with." Fortunately, among the 120 enlisted men was a radio technician, RT-1C Virgil R. Rambo, who carried a Collins transceiver radio, TSC. He would shortly put the set to good use. On the 20th of August, the Leathernecks saw 31 aircraft land on lumpy Henderson Field, a gift from the gods and the highlight of the day. It was the first echelon of Marine Air Group 23, AMAG 23, comprising one squadron, VMF 223, of 19 F-4 Wildcat fighters and another squadron, VMSB 232, of 12 SBD-3 Dauntless dive bombers. The following day, the seaplane tender McFarland pulled into Cookham Harbour and unloaded 102 ground crew and 6 pilots from VMF 212. Another 170 members of VMF 223 were shipped on the transport William Ward Burroughs, Ep.6, which departed Pearl Harbor on the 3rd of August and reached Tulagi on the 29th. The next day, they boarded LCPs for a wet ride across Sealark Channel to Guadalcanal to rejoin their squadron. The air group, including a headquarters with its own post office, was now complete. 2 days later, the Wildcats of VMF 224 and the SBDs of VMSB 231 would arrive to augment the mixed air units of the Cactus Air Force. On the night of the 20th of August, when the first aircraft had touched down on Henderson Field, Pursuit Wilbur F. Bewley and PFC Leo Campbell of Company G, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, were on outpost duty near the 1st Marines beach defences. A few minutes after midnight, the two heard bursts of machine gun fire from the direction of the river, the opening shots of what would be called the Battle of the Tanaru. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a large, bedraggled Solomon Islander came staggering toward Bewley's post. Bewley had been told that anyone in front of him would be the enemy, and to act accordingly. Bewley states he had shouted to the man, "You better stop or you're a dead fool!" The man raised his hands above his head, pleading that Bewley not shoot him, as he was no Japanese. Jacob Vuza, the man Bewley was detaining, had been a retired sergeant major in the Solomon Islands Protectorate Constabulary, and now was one of Clemens's scouts. He had been captured by Colonel Ichiki's soldiers while on a local patrol. They had interrogated and tortured him, bayoneted him repeatedly, and left him for dead. But Vuza had chewed through his ropes and escaped. Bewley had indeed noticed the man's blood-stained lava, the rectangular cloth that native islanders wore around their waist. He called out to the corporal of the guard, Elias D. Holtz, who took charge and delivered Vuza to Lieutenant Luther Jordan. Jordan took the man to the command post of Lieutenant Colonel Edwin A. Pollock, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines. There, Vuza, who believed he was dying, poured out his heart to Martin Clemens in a long message for his family. But before he passed out from loss of blood, The indomitable scout also gave Clemens detailed information on Colonel Ichiki's force, including numbers of men and weapons. Clemens immediately telephoned the information to Lieutenant Colonel Jerry Thomas at the command post, which the occupants called the Impact Center. Earlier, the Marine Corps leadership had considered that the ideal location for the enemy to land would be on the beaches, and consequently that was to be the main line of resistance, MLR. The Marines built a 600-yard defense, nearly 5.5 miles, from the west side of the mouth of the ILU River, just west of Tanaru, continuing on around Lunga Point to the abandoned village of Kukum. The ILU flank was set 600 yards inland on the first high ground of the coastal hills. 2 battalions of the 5th Marines garrisoned the line from Kukum village to the west bank of the Lunga River, just east of Lunga Point, and the balance was held by the 1st Marine Regiment along the tidal lagoon called Alligator Creek, which was set apart from the ocean waters by a 100-foot-long sandbar, 25 to 50 feet wide. South of the Henderson airstrip, a 9,000-yard stretch was guarded by the 1st Pioneer Battalion, the guns of the 11th Marines, the 1st Amphibian Tractor Battalion, and the 1st Engineer Battalion. On the 21st of August at 0240, the vanguard of the 2nd Company of the Ichiki Detachment, 1st Battalion, 28th Infantry Regiment, after a 20-mile night march from Taivu Point, struck from the jungle at the flimsy but determined defences of the Marines who held positions on the western side of the airfield at the Alligator Creek Lagoon. The sandpit there represented the open door to the airfield defences, but there was a deadly obstacle. Behind it were 930 Leathernecks from the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, with a similar number from the 3rd Battalion on their left and the 1st Battalion in reserve. The night was pitch black, and it was raining. Ichiki's soldiers shed their knapsacks and all non-essential equipment so as not to impede their attack. At about 2200, a flare went off and lit the jungle east of the Lunga River. Nothing happened. All was quiet. To check it out, part of Company A, 1st Marines, led by Captain Brush and 2nd Lieutenant Victor Valenti, had been aggressively patrolling the outskirts of the 1st Marine defensive sector to determine the enemy's strength beyond the coconut groves. Finding nothing, they had returned to the bivouac area. Just in front of Company G, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, was the sandbar formed by the Tanaru River and the ocean tides, the place where Ichiki's men would attack. The sandbar formed near the mouth of the Tanaru because the stream flowed only at high tide. At low tide, there is a sizable area of exposed beach. Within minutes, the major assault was underway. To see where they were heading, the attackers set off another flare. Momentarily, it was like daylight. The time was 0310. The battle began with a mass of preparatory fire from the attackers' Model 99 Arisaka that sent sheets of 7.7mm shells toward the Leatherneck lines. The Marines, however, had a primitive secret weapon that was effective only at dark, a band of rusty barbed wire strung across the 50-foot sandbar between the lagoon and the beach. The wire had been stripped off a plantation fence used to control cattle and had been installed on the east bank of the sandbar. The lead wave of about 200 from the 2nd Company under Captain Tetsuro Sawada made a dash across the ILU River, the Nakagawa, only to be met with a hail of deadly fire from Captain James F. Sherman's Company G. Pershit Masahiro Hayashi of 2nd Lieutenant Goro Ohashi's platoon was the 2nd Company's only survivor. He had been wounded in the left hip and had remained in the water until almost daybreak, then slowly made his way back the way he had come. On the opposite side of the river was Pertut P.C. Becker, who could see nothing. He described how the battle came on suddenly with intense firing, and he thought the Japanese were crazy. Pirt Gilbert Deloff of Company E, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, also recalls, "It was a dark, moonless night and difficult to see very far. Bill Wallace had a position to my left, and on my right there was a machine gun post and a 37mm gun beyond that. Suddenly, all hell broke loose as Wallace started firing towards the 210 Hells Island surf. Directly in front of me was a dead tree. Wallace shouted to me that the Japanese were hiding behind it, so I began firing at each end of it." Meanwhile, Japanese artillery fire from 2nd Lieutenant Taiswaru Hamani's #1 field gun, Type 92 77mm, continued. Deloff recalls, "The artillery fire seemed to be wounding quite a lot of our guys, and the machine gun near me got knocked out. The only survivor brought me some ammunition, which was a godsend because I was getting low." Most of the firing was coming from the river with artillery, mortars, from Captain Tetsuro Sawada's company's mortar squad, and machine guns from 1st Lieutenant Shigenao Komatsu's heavy machine guns, 8 squads, and rifles. We kept firing until Japanese artillery began to land among us. One hit Pursuit William Wallace's D11 position, and he got hurt badly. Then Puffit Ray Roberts, E21, got killed nearby, and another hit on the emplacement killed Ray, Percy James P. Edlin, E21, and 2 others, all guys I'd been through training with. In the darkness, at least 2 companies of the attackers became partly enmeshed in the barbed wire. 1st Lieutenant Yusaku Higuchi's company and 1st Lieutenant Hirozo Maruyama's 3rd Company. The Marines were under tremendous pressure. The Japanese were met by lethal fire from machine guns and 2 37mm anti-tank guns, manned by 2 platoons of Battery B, 1st Special Weapons Battalion, under 2nd Lieutenant James F. McClanahan. The anti-tank guns, placed in an ideal position on the point opposite the sandpit, later called Hell's Point, were loaded with canister shot, large shells filled with shrapnel. During the battle, they were fired every 5 to 6 seconds. For a short while, Ichiki's men were in disarray, then they ploughed on, only to be killed in the onslaught. One group of Lieutenant Maruyama's attackers, under 2nd Lieutenant Matsuo Yoshimoto, took possession of an abandoned Amtrak standing in the river. About a week before the attack, the Marines had sunk 2 LVT-1 alligators in a stream that was the headwaters of the Tanaru and built a bridge over them. Matsuo's men set up their own machine gun on the Amtrak and fired at the Marines. Meanwhile, back at Tanaru Point, the enemy had struck the Marine line using mortars and grenades to knock out the troops of B Battery, who were manning and protecting the 37mm anti-tank weapon. The attackers, 1st Lieutenant Hideo Goto's engineers, broke through on the right flank and one of the anti-tank gun crews was wiped out. But the Marines regrouped and, in hand-to-hand combat, killed the enemy. PUSIT's Harry R. Horsman and E. Carter, CPL Larry DiPietro Antonio, and Sergeant James W. Hancock took over and kept the gun firing. For his extraordinary performance during this action, Sergeant Hancock received the Silver Star. 2nd Lieutenant William Horf, Colorado of Company H, had his 4 machine guns in place close to those of Company G's .30 and .50 caliber weapons. 3 of his crew, Al Schmid, Leroy Diamond, and Johnny Rivers, were awarded the Navy Cross for this action, the 2nd highest award given by the Marine Corps. Rivers's award was posthumous. Company G's 60mm mortars took a terrible toll on the Japanese across the river in the Coconut Grove. Bodies and body parts flew in all directions. Peyertz, Harry Trigger Briggs, and George Hoffman, 2 of the Browning automatic riflemen, were situated at Tanaru Point. They reported that their weapons were so hot from firing that they were afraid the BARs would lock up. Pursuit Henry Brunkhurst, a former baseball pitcher, was able to throw hand grenades right in the middle of the onrushing Japanese. The battalion commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Edwin A. Pollock, was seen bending low while moving along the line of riflemen, telling everyone in his calm and competent way to "stay low, sight your target and squeeze 'em off." Pollock proved to be an inspiring combat leader. All of his company commanders, Lieutenants Jordan, Matthews, and Codria, similarly demonstrated superb leadership. Both Colonel Pollock and Lieutenant George Codria would receive the Navy Cross for heroics in the battle. Lieutenant McClanahan would receive the Silver Star, but was recommended for the Navy Cross. At 0400, 1st Lieutenant Toshiro Chiba's company plunged forward under 2nd Platoon Leader, 2nd Lieutenant Akiro Imano. At about this time, 1st Lieutenant Shigenao Komatsu, the commander of the 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry Machine Gun Company, had his 8 Type 92 heavy machine guns in place on the left flank and began firing in unison. When the gunfire briefly abated, Komatsu urged his men to continue. The Marines, momentarily stunned, had been directing their fire on stopping Ichiki's soldiers, who had fallen by the hundreds. Then they concentrated on silencing Komatsu's gunners. At 0410, the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, received orders from the division to support the 1st Marines by combing the area for stray enemy. Marine guts and tenacity played a key role in blunting the enemy assault. Heroism was everywhere. The Japanese phalanx fell apart. At sunrise, 0445, the remnants of Colonel Ichiki's men withdrew to the jungle to renew the attack, only to be hammered by 3 75mm guns and one 105mm gun of the 11th Marines, whose weapons had zeroed in on their assembly area and about 1,000 yards of the beach. The Japanese would not surrender, though only a handful survived. They crawled away to their rear area, no doubt telling their comrades of the unceasing ferocity of the U.S. Marines. After the battle, one of Colonel Ichiki's infantrymen commented, "The American volume of fire was wild beyond imagination." Another, Eldage Pert Yoshimasa Naide, of 2nd Lieutenant Masao Ingaki's platoon, a gunner who had service in China, said, "Our heavy machine guns were firing coordinated probing fire, so Mr. Enemy returned fire like a madman." At 0800 on the morning of the 21st, Lieutenant Colonel Leonard B. Cresswell, commanding officer of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, ordered Captain Bush's Company A and 1st Lieutenant Nikolai S. Stevenson's Company C to advance west in a flanking nutcracker movement to squeeze and annihilate any enemy in the groves. Cresswell placed his B Company under 1st Lieutenant Marshall T. Armstrong as a rear guard at the mouth of the ILU River. At 0830, the division ordered Lieutenant Colonel Frederick C. B. Bush's 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, to move overland to the east bank of the Matanikau River to prevent any Japanese from filtering past. During that morning, the newly arrived F-4 F-4S of MAG-23, flying along the coast, also attacked and sank a few small enemy supply boats heading toward the battle zone. The light tanks of A Company, 1st Tank Battalion, were ordered to seek out any enemy. Sergeant Earl J. Mowery, one of the commanders of an M2A4 tank, later called the Stuart tank, remembered, "A platoon of 4 Stuarts, led by 1st Lieutenant Leo B. Case, advanced to support the riflemen. We drove down a trail through the coconut palm to a spit of sand across the mouth of the ILU River. The tanks lumbered across the sandbar and engaged the enemy, crashing into the palm trees to knock them over and eject the hidden Japanese. One tank was knocked out by enemy fire, but the crew was rescued, and the tanks continued the advance, firing canister as they moved. They ran over many bodies during the battle, crushing them under the tracks. Most of the Marine casualties occurred as the Leathernecks followed the tanks. The wounded enemy pretended to be dead until an American passed. Then from behind the Japanese would shoot, stick him with a bayonet, or throw a grenade. All the while the engagement had been raging, RT-1C Virgil Rambo, the Cub 1 radio operator, had set up his Collins transceiver on a nearby hill to report the various stages of the battle to the division. The melee lasted 16 hours, with the division on edge until it was over. Touring the area late on the 21st, the Marines could not believe the grisly scene before them, terribly mangled bodies now covered with maggots and flies. Most of the men gagged and vomited. About 777 of Colonel Ichiki's infantrymen would not return to Asahigawa City, Hokkaido. They were either buried at Coley Point, in a sandlot, or in the coconut grove, or were washed out to sea. Excerpts from the diary of Lieutenant Jack Fuller, USNR, of the Lunga boat pool describe the horror. "Regarding what we called the Tanaru battlefield, I have never seen in my life such a sight. The bodies did not only have gunshot wounds, but were horribly mangled. The heads of most of them were blown off. The bodies were all ripped open and the entrails spilled on the ground. Arms and legs were lying all over the area." 15 wounded Japanese, heavily blood-stained, were captured and taken within the Marine lines. 30 survivors, in mixed physical and emotional condition, including 2 officers, Second Lieutenant Toshio, the Assistant Adjutant, and First Lieutenant Yoshiaki Sakakibara, the Assistant Communication Officer, somehow managed to crawl away and get back to Taivu Point. One of the 30, Suppursit Isamu Mashiko, had staggered in after 4 days of wandering around. Others that made it back included Corporal Tanaka, PFC Takashichi Makabe, CPL, Shoji Setoda, Goto Engineering Company, Sergeant Sadanobu Okada, Sergeant Masatoshi Mai, PET Tadshi Suzuki, PFC Kuragand, and PFC Kiyoshi Ono, 228th Machine Gun Company. 10 that had returned joined the rear echelon of 40 men from 2nd Lieutenant Daizo Umeda's transport unit. Another 40 soldiers from the Sato platoon were fortunate, as they had missed the battle because they stayed behind to bury those killed at Coley Point. 34 Marines were lost forever and 75 wounded. The 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, lost the most men, with 25 killed and 44 wounded. The 1st Battalion lost 7 KIA and 13 WIA, while the Special Weapons Battalion, a division unit, lost 2 KIA and 14 WIA. 1 man was wounded from the 1st Marines Regimental Weapons Company, and 3 from the Headquarters and Service Company. 1 doctor, Lieutenant L.G. Safier, USNR, was killed as he went forward to give immediate first aid. After the battle, the most severely wounded were evacuated in the high-speed transport Colquhoun to Efate Island in the New Hebrides for treatment at the U.S. Naval Base Hospital H2 at Port Vila. On the 21st of August, Captain Kanai Monzen sent the following message to the 8th Fleet at Rabaul from the Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters located near Point Cruz. From about 0200-0400, we heard sounds of a furious battle near the airfield area. 5 small planes took off at 0400, 0600, and circled above. The 5 that took off landed between 0500 and 0530. They did not take off again. We continued to hear the sounds of gunfire. We saw no takeoffs or flights. We guessed that our advance troops' attack on the airfield was proceeding favorably for our side. Please convey to the Ichiki detachment that many construction unit workers are retreating through the tropical forest around the airfield. Late that evening, however, IJN headquarters at Rabaul received another wire. The Ichiki advanced troops were almost completely annihilated this morning at a site near the airfield, without reaching the field. This communication was received from the East Point Lookout Station, Point Taivu, via the Boston Maru. The message came from First Lieutenant Yoshiaki Sakakibara, Colonel Ichiki's assistant signal officer. Major General Akisaburo Futami, the former Chief of Staff, 17th Army, later recalled the reaction to the news about the Ichiki detachment. We at the Oki Army, 17th Army Headquarters, had acknowledged a communication from the Navy earlier that the Ichiki detachment made a bloodless landing, but later there was no more contact with the Ichiki unit. When I was resting in my quarters on August 22nd at about 23:25 Tokyo time, Lieutenant Colonel Hiroshi Matsumoto, the senior staff officer, came to me and said, "They tell me the Navy received a wire saying the Ichiki detachment was annihilated." Matsumoto smiled and added, "I think it's a false report." Wireless communication from Guadalcanal could not reach us without Navy transmission. We had no recourse but to rely on the Navy. On the 23rd, the Navy analysed in detail all wires we received. As a result, we reached a conclusion that the battle situation of the Ichiki detachment was not necessarily to be viewed with optimism. Also, if they had succeeded in taking the airfield, they would have reported it immediately. 4 days had passed since they landed. It might have been an overstatement to say annihilated. However, we could not help but reach the conclusion that they were forced into a desperate battle. At this point, we cancelled the planned summons of a detachment of 1 battalion from the Kawaguchi Shitai, Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi's detachment, to Rabaul as a reserve unit, and decided to throw all 3 battalions of the Kawaguchi detachment into Guadalcanal. At 2200, on the 21st of August, the 1,000 men of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines from Tulagi, joined the 1st and 3rd Battalions on Guadalcanal and were assigned as the Division Reserve, positioned near Henderson Field, between the Lunga and Tanaru rivers. The only action they had seen on Tulagi in the past 10 days was the burying of dead Japanese. However, on the 21st, the Marines also saw the US Navy for the first time in almost 2 weeks, when the supply ships Alhina and Fomalhaut, aka 5, escorted by the destroyers Blue, DD 387, Helm, DD 388, and Henley, DD 391, arrived at Lunga Roads, the offshore anchorage. The next day, the 22nd of August, the first USAAF aircraft landed on dusty Henderson Field. 5 P-400S, the export version of the Bell P-39 Airacobra that the RAF had rejected, were flown from Tontuta, New Caledonia, via Efate and Espiritu Santo. 2 B-17S from the 11th Bombardment Group shepherded the fighters from Santo to Guadalcanal. The superb mechanics of the 67th Fighter Squadron had assembled the P-39S at Tontuta from crated models and without blueprints, a Herculean task. But the aircraft were inadequate surplus models from Lend-Lease, without oxygen equipment. They were called Pete and Repeat by the Marines, yet they ultimately would do yeoman service in the hodgepodge assemblage of aircraft and pilots of US Marine, Navy and Army Air units of the Cactus Air Force, which would carve itself an honoured place in military history. The day after the pilots and aircraft arrived, the Fomalhaut carried to Guadalcanal an advance ground crew of 30 from the 67th Fighter Squadron. The Marine pilots showed the airmen of the 67th a palm grove with some scattered tents. "Our camp," they said. To bed down, they provided them with straw mats, courtesy of the departed Japanese. When asked where the Japanese were, the Marines replied, "See that river over there?" pointing to a stream about 200 yards away. "They are on the other side." On the 24th, more help arrived when 29 SBD-3 Dauntless dive bombers and 6 Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers from the carrier Saratoga landed on the airstrip and spent the night. They took off the following morning, leaving behind 27 1,000-pound bombs, which were pulled to the side and stacked. However, rear ADM, Sadayoshi Yamada's Imperial Japanese Navy Eagles, spotted the cache and planted a bomb nearby. It missed the 13.5 tons of explosives, but the blast flung the 1,000-pounders around the area like bowling pins. The Cubs subsequently gathered the bombs and moved them to safety. While the Marines were rejoicing in the new air power on the field, the Japanese at Truk had their own plans for Guadalcanal, as outlined in the following order. The Enemy Surface Force Task Force, including 1 or 2 aircraft carriers, has appeared southeast of the Solomon Yias. The enemy seems to be reinforcing his strength in the Tulagi area, and about the 20th, 25 enemy planes landed on the Guadalcanal airfield. Our fleet is proceeding rapidly to San Cristobal Island area in order to destroy it. The first echelon of the Ichiki detachment is advancing toward the airfield mainly by night movements, and by the morning of the 20th, its front line has reached Tetere. It is now making preparations to capture the airfield by night attack. The second echelon of the Ichiki detachment should land on the night of the 24th. The Guadalcanal Navy Garrison Unit, besieged by the enemy, is engaging in desperate fighting and will defend its positions until the last. The Kawaguchi detachment, cooperating with Navy forces, will first quickly destroy the enemy on Tulagi and firmly secure it. The regiment, less 1 company and 2 platoons, will exert every effort to conclude quickly the debarkation of the Kawaguchi detachment. Meanwhile, the Cactus Air Force was continuing to add all the aircraft the rear bases could muster. On the 24th of August, additional air reinforcements were received when 11 SBDs from the carrier Enterprise, Flight 300, flew into Henderson Field. The SBDs dropped their 500-pound bombs in Sealark Channel before landing in order to prevent accidents. The following day, a consolidated PBY-5, a flying boat from Espiritu Santo, landed at Henderson. On board was Lieutenant Cedar Joseph P. Paul Blunden, USNR, commanding officer of the 6th Naval Construction Battalion. Blunden had been ordered to Guadalcanal for two reasons. First, to inspect the airfield and note what was required. Second, to pave the way for the transfer of the 6th NCB from Espiritu Santo to Guadalcanal. He dallied at Henderson, however, and lost his ride back to Espiritu Santo when the PBY took off without him, leaving him the lone CB on the canal. This, however, gave him the honour of being the first CB under fire in World War II in the Pacific. While Blunden was working on plans for base improvements, his staff on Espiritu Santo was making plans to transfer the first echelon to Guadalcanal. On the 27th of August, 9 P-39S, dubbed the Clunkers, from the 67th Fighter Squadron from New Caledonia, the Game Cock Squadron, landed on the Henderson airstrip, guided to the field by B-17S of the 11th Bomb Group. On the same day, one of Colonel Leroy Hunt's battalions, the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, under Lieutenant Colonel William E. Maxwell, moved out from Lunga Plains on a patrol to the Matanikau area via Kokumbona, directly amidst a Japanese naval concentration and supply point. They ran into some remnants of Lieutenant Akira Tanabe's 84th Guard unit there, as well as the security units of the 11th and 13th CU. Colonel Maxwell, playing it safe, radioed back and asked for help, requesting landing craft to transport his unit back to the perimeter. No one knew what the Japanese had in the way of troop strength, as most of the 5th Marines intelligence staff had been killed on the Gurtka patrol. But Colonel Hunt did not like Maxwell's plan, and therefore sacked him. He took direct command of the 1st Battalion and continued to recon the area. The enemy force under Lieutenant Akira Tanabe, seeing the size of Hunt's force, decided to break contact, and thus the 1/5th made its way back to the perimeter via the coastal route. The vanguard of the 6th Naval Construction Battalion, consisting of 387 enlisted men and 5 officers under Lieutenant J.G. Thomas L. Stamp, boarded the Betelgeuse at Espiritu Santo on the 30th of August and arrived at Lunga Roads 2 days later. By the time the Seabees reached Guadalcanal, the airfield's coral off-ramps were filled with aircraft, though not all were in flying condition. Some had already reached the boneyard, the result of unsuccessful takeoffs and landings due to potholes or enemy activity. The day before, the 29th of August, had brought bad news for the Marines when 5 Imperial Japanese Navy destroyers landed 750 troops at Taivu Point, 300 from the 2nd Echelon of the Ichiki Detachment, and 450 from Major Yukichi Kokusho's 1st Battalion, 124th Infantry, 35th Brigade. On the 30th, another 5 destroyers delivered 700 men from the 2nd Echelon of the Ichiki Detachment to Taivu Point. The 31st brought to Taivu some 11 to 1,200 men on 8 destroyers from General Kawaguchi's 35th Brigade. On the same day, the 31st of August, aircraft from the Saratoga's squadrons, VS-3, VF-5 and VT-8, landed at Henderson to augment the Cactus Air Force. 2 weeks later, unexpected help arrived when 11 aircraft of VS-71 from the carrier Wasp flew in. The Wasp later was sunk on the 15th of September in Torpedo Junction, the area between San Cristobal and Espiritu Santo. Siada Takaichi Kinashi's I-19 submarine torpedoed her with an array of 3 out of 6 fired, while she was en route to Santo. The balance of the Wasp's aircraft were flown to Luganville Airdrome, Espiritu Santo, New Hebrides. The maintenance crews were sent to Efate Island. By the end of August, the recently arrived Lieutenant Hugh Mackenzie of the Royal Australian Navy, the deputy supervising officer from Port Vila, Efate Island, had set up a radio station in a former Japanese dugout at the northwest side of Henderson Field. Major Snedeker, the division communication officer, gave Mackenzie 5 Marine radio operators from the 1st Signal Company to monitor the Coast Watcher network, and they were able to receive advance word of any incoming air raids. Added to that, a recently received radar set was put in operation, picking up incoming enemy aircraft 125 miles away. Both enhanced the air defense of the island, as the Japanese unfinished radar station the Marines had discovered was so incomplete that it was impossible to put in service. On the 1st of September 1942, Companies A and D of the 6th Naval Construction Battalion came ashore at Lunga Point from the Betelgeuse. Lieutenant Cedar Mark H. Jordan, executive officer of the 6th NCB, fondly referred to these CBs as the confused fools. Their campsite, located on Lever's plantation and called Mosquito Gulch, was centered between two clearings, Henderson Field and the soon-to-be-built Fighter Strip No. 1. Upon their arrival, a lone Betty bomber had initiated the 6th CBs to the air war over Guadalcanal. It was an ineffective attack, but bombs hit the strip at a few spots, and the Bs came to call Henderson Field Pothole Hen. On their second day on Guadalcanal, Company D immediately took over construction and maintenance of the airstrip from the Leatherneck Engineers, led by Lieutenant J.G. Alma P. Pratt with CMM Floyd L. Johnson as crew chief. The Marine Engineers had made the runway 3,800 feet long and 150 feet wide, with a 150-foot clearance zone adjacent to the runway. The Seabees used an odd assortment of machinery, including 2 HD-7 bulldozers, 6 International 1.5, yard dump trucks, 24 Japanese low-bed rolling stock vehicles, 1 Adams patrol grader, and 1 traxcavator. Later, 5-yard Garwood carryall scrapers and 2 smaller scrapers were borrowed from the 1st Engineer Battalion. The pilots loved the Seabees. They knew they would be able to land when they returned from a hunt, because the 6th NCB had developed a fill-in system to take care of the potholes. Flying squads, dump trucks loaded with crushed coral, were stationed adjacent to the field, with just the right amount of the gravelly fill to cover a hole made by a 500-pound bomb. At the end of a bombing, the trucks would dash out and unload the crushed coral, then Chief Johnson's crew would quickly fill the craters. The airstrip was the 6th's primary construction assignment. Although the Marine Engineers had completed sufficient work to make the field usable for fighters, the flat cross-section gave no slope for drainage, and little was done to provide a wearable surface. With pelting rains, the heavy flight traffic constantly dug up and rutted the surface. The Seabees had the dual task of keeping the strip continuously in usable condition, and later of extending it to 5,000 feet or more for the use of B-17S and B-24S. For the problem of water accumulation on the soil bed base, the Seabees created a cross-slope that would shed rain and provide a wearable surface. While one group tackled the first field project, the other crews began felling coconut trees to clear the way for the airstrip's extension. As soon as a power shovel was obtained, it was put to use in the bed of the Lunga River, excavating gravel for the crowning surfacing job. On the 4th of September, an R-4D transport from VMJ 253 flew the 880 miles from New Caledonia to Henderson Field. On board were Brig General Roy S. Geiger, Commanding General, 1st Marine Air Wing, Colonel Lewis Woods, and Lieutenant Colonel John C. Munn, the wing's D2, under whom the staff of MAG-23 became an intricate part of the 1st Air Wing operations. The inter-service Cactus Air Force made its headquarters in the Pagoda, the former Japanese officers' lounge. The R-4D, the U.S. Navy's version of the ubiquitous Douglas DC-3, served as either a cargo carrier, the Skytrain, or a passenger plane, the Skytrooper. The Skytrains of New Caledonia-based MAG-25, comprising VMJ 152 and VMJ 253, would become the backbone of a unique airlift service that supported the ground and air forces on Guadalcanal. They flew everything imaginable, from food to wire, torpedoes, aviation gasoline, medical supplies, personnel, and the U.S. mail. On November 24th, they became part of the South Pacific Combat Air Transport Command, SCAT, sometimes referred to as the Southern Cross Airline. Eventually, 38 MAG-25R4Ds were engaged in transporting critical supplies to the island and returning with sick and wounded for hospitals in the rear area. Later, the C-47S of the USAAF's 13th Troop Carrier Squadron were merged into SCAT to augment the Sky Trains. The C-47S, the workhorses of the 13th Air Force, became the backbone of the Army Air Force's air delivery service. These flying boxcars were a godsend to the men on Guadalcanal. 2 were lost during the campaign. When Martin Clemens's scouts reported the landing of a large number of enemy troops in the vicinity of Tasimboco, about 18 miles east of the Lunga Delta, Clemens informed the Marine Command. General Vandegrift promptly dispatched the 1st Raider and 1st Parachute Battalions under Colonel Merritt A. Edson to confront the Japanese. The tenacity of the Raiders and Paramarines impressed Vandegrift so much that he gave them unusual and demanding assignments, such as the one to Tasimboco. The Raiders would spearhead the attack, with the Chutes as the supporting echelon. On the evening of September 7th, the Raiders embarked on the destroyer transports Manly, APD-1, and McKean. The plan was to have Company B land on the right of the beach, Company A on the left, and Company C as the battalion reserve. Although the Raiders landed a short distance from the Japanese lookout post at Taivu Point, where the majority of Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi's 35th Brigade was bivouacked, they did not attack but headed instead for Tasimboco village. Clemens's scouts had reported about 300 Japanese in the area. However, that estimate had radically changed. During the evening of September 7th, Clemens's men brought word that the enemy force at Tasimboco had grown to several thousand. The actual count was 6,722. Similarly, Major General Kawaguchi had arrived on Guadalcanal with inadequate intelligence, believing there were no more than 2,000 Marines on the island and that they could be quickly dispatched. This was based on information he had received at Truk on August 20th. He would later regret being unprepared. That night, First Lieutenant Hagiwara landed at Tasimboco from the mine layer Tsugaru, commanding 53 men in a battery of 75mm field guns from the 1st Company, 1st Battalion, 2nd Field Artillery Regiment, 2nd Infantry Division. Hagiwara left his 4 75mm guns at Tasimboco under the protection of the 124th Infantry before leaving for Taivu Point with his artillerymen to report to the 35th Brigade. The bulk of General Kawaguchi's troops had encamped near Tetere, 10 miles east of Tasimboco. At Tasimboco there was just a guard unit, 2 companies of the 124th Infantry under Lieutenants Aise and Uyanura. At about 6:30 the following morning, they sighted the 2 smoking old destroyers, the Manly and McKean, and several other warships behind them. Thinking that a major landing was about to take place, they faded into the jungle. What they saw steaming behind the 2 destroyers was a convoy of 2 transports and 5 warships headed for Lunga roads. Adding to the Japanese woes, at 6:47 their position was attacked by 2 Douglas SPD Dauntless dive bombers of MAG-23 and 4 P-400, P-39 Airacobras from the 67th Fighter Squadron. The Tasimboco landing force consisted of 501 men of the 1st Raiders. Captain Robert P. Nufa took a flanking column through the jungle as the main body of the Raiders approached Tasimboco village from the south. Instead of 300 Japanese, they found Kawaguchi's supply point, complete with hundreds of neatly stacked knapsacks, bedrolls, and packets of condensed food. Later, they discovered Lieutenant Hagiwara's 4 field guns and 1 37mm anti-tank gun of the 124th Infantry, all of which were destroyed. The Manly and the McKean returned to Kukum late in the morning and embarked 208 members of the 1st Parachute Battalion. These were joined by 103 men from Company E, 1st Raider Battalion, who boarded 2 district patrol vessels, YP-298 and YP-346, 100-foot-long wooden tuna fishing boats from California. At 12:10, this rear echelon arrived at Tasimboco, allowing the combined forces to push on. A subsequent firefight ensued in which 27 Japanese were killed. 2 raiders were killed and 6 wounded. The Marines ransacked the Japanese supplies, destroying a great quantity of stores and equipment, much food, and all types of ammunition. Several large radios were smashed, a major loss. A good haul of sake was salvaged, however, and General Kawaguchi would miss his white duck trousers, which ended up in the possession of coast watcher Martin Clemens. The Japanese were on the island with a primary purpose, to push the Americans off and recapture the airstrip. The 1st Marine Division was aware the enemy would strike, but where that would be was the concern. Colonels Edson and Thomas, both gifted officers, surmised that Kawaguchi would attack at the west entrance to the airstrip from over a protruding grass-covered knoll south of the strip, which they called Lunga Ridge. Major James C. Murray, the division adjutant, informed a group of officers that the Japanese were coming with 5,000 men. Red Mike Edson, who had made his mark as the conqueror of Tulagi and captain of the Tasimboko raid, was given the task of defending this position. He was one of General Vandergrift's most resolute commanders. The raiders and the Paramarines would be the brick wall the soldiers would have to breach to reach their objective, and the able Edson would prove a stalwart gatekeeper. Meanwhile, at the Japanese naval camp, PO-2C Sankichi Kaneda had been summoned to the headquarters of the Guadalcanal Defense Unit located in the jungle about a half-mile southwest of Point Cruz. He was told that because he had escaped the enemy and returned to his unit by way of the area south and west of the Lunga airfield, Henderson Field, he was to immediately guide Colonel Oka's 124th Infantry Regiment there. Kaneda was dismayed, telling his superior, "The sun is about to set. When I escaped, it was in daylight, and I just had to watch the sky for enemy planes. I couldn't travel at night." But he was told, "No one else knows the area. Go." Kaneda continues, "I was permitted to ask for a subordinate, so I chose SM-1 C. Yoshio Takada. The 124th Infantry Unit promptly moved out with the 2 of us in the advanced guard and marched along the left bank of the Matanikau River. It was pitch black. We moved at a crawl. At 12 o'clock we reached a log bridge over the river. It was difficult crossing at dark. I followed my compass east, pushing and cutting a path. By the 11th, we were through the upper reaches of one of the branches of the Lunga River. Colonel Oka was able to identify the target, and he gave orders for a long rest. Being so close to the enemy, the men could not smoke. We ate hardtack. We were tired and we slept like dead. We were awakened and the march was resumed. It was a daylight movement, our long file stretched out like a giant snake. At noon we reached Shishi, Lion Hill, where through field glasses we could see the airfield. That evening we enjoyed white rice. The plan was for the Oka Butai to attack when they heard the Kuma Battalion, the 7th Infantry Division, on the east begin their shelling. After that, Colonel Oka gave the order to attack. It seems almost an hour had passed before they had assembled, while a long line file of men straggled out of the bush and formed squads and then platoons. Finally, the attack began. At the airfield, one of the first tasks of Division Ordnance was to send a ton of grenades to the ridge where the Marines were digging zigzag trenches and foxholes along a 1,000-foot line. It was there, on September 12, 14, that General Kawaguchi and his 35th Brigade suffered an historic defeat. The Battle of the Ridge marked a turning point in the Pacific War, for it was the only time during the land campaign when the Americans could really have been so soundly defeated that the Japanese could have retaken Henderson Field. After the battle, Lunga Ridge became known as Edson's Ridge. Later, war correspondents coined the name Bloody Ridge. General Kawaguchi's 35th Brigade was split into 3 assault forces, the central body and the left and right wings. The central body consisted of 2,100 men under General Kawaguchi with the brigade headquarters and a unit from the Guard Company. The force included the 1st Battalion, 124th Infantry under Major Yukichi Kokusho, 2 guns of the 124th Regimental Gun Company under 1st Lieutenant Chifiwa, 2 37mm guns of the 124th Regimental Anti-Tank Company under 1st Lieutenant Kaoru Hisatomi, the 3rd Battalion, 124th Infantry, under Lieutenant Colonel Kusukichi Watanabe, 1 platoon each of the 7th and 15th Independent Engineer Regiments under 2nd Lieutenant Mortoto, 37 men of the 24th Water Purification Unit, the Kudo Medical Unit from the 67th Line of Communication Hospital, and the 6th Radio Unit. The left wing, led by Colonel Akinosuke Oka, included the 124th Infantry Regimental Headquarters under Adjutant Captain Masato Yamazaki, the 124th Signal Company under 1st Lieutenant Yukio Moriguchi, the 28th Regimental Machine Gun Company under 1st Lieutenant Shigenao Kokatsu, and a small engineering unit and a radio unit. Colonel Oka was dependent on his 2 infantry battalions, supported by his gun contingents. They included one 75mm gun of the 124th Regimental Gun Company under 1st Lieutenant Yoshibe Nagao, 2 37mm anti-tank guns of the 124th Regimental Anti-Tank Company, the 2nd Battalion, 124th Infantry, 2, 124Y, under Major Etsuo Takamatsu, and the 3rd Battalion, 4th Infantry, under Captain Mori Sasaki, led by the 5th Company, 4th Infantry. Due to tardiness, however, the 3rd Battalion, 4th Infantry, missed the battle. The bulk of the 4th Infantry, with Colonel Naomasa Nakaguma commanding, was still aboard the Sado Maru in Kamimbo Bay when the 35th Brigade was attacking the airfield. The right wing was composed of the rear echelon of the Ichiki Detachment, identified as the Kuma Battalion, commanded by Major Eiji Mizuno. The 7th Company, 124th Infantry, was commanded by 1st Lieutenant Shingo Shimokawa. It was supported by 14 guns, 4 75mm of the 28th Regimental Gun Company under 1st Lieutenant Kakuro Wada, 4 37mm of the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Company, 4 37mm of the 28th Regimental Anti-Tank Company under 1st Lieutenant Yoshio Okubo, plus 2 75mm of the 124th Regimental Gun Company. This assemblage of weapons was identified as the Nakaoka Artillery Unit. Captain Isoa Nakaoka originally had commanded the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Company. The Nakaoka Artillery Unit's 6 75mm guns would be set back into the hills to support the drive. The central body, spearheaded by the 124th Infantry, planned to approach the ridge from 3 directions, exiting from the jungle. General Kawaguchi had his overworked 6th Independent Shipping Engineer Regiment cut a sodden jungle trail from Kawaguchi's rear assembly point to the outskirts of the ridge, a path well concealed by the thick tropical growth. The muddy, narrow course permitted the men to move only single file, and the march through dense jungle in 110-degree inland heat with no breeze taxed the already exhausted troops. But it was not just the devilish jungle that distressed the general. First, it was the maps. Kawaguchi had an old piloting chart of the island with its unknown interior, thus he shifted around by compass. Then it was his headquarters, challenging his patience as it moved around, keeping him out of contact. In addition, the force was moving north, but was unable to reach the assigned position by noon, and with the next shift to the south, the command had become scattered. Nevertheless, moving through the jungle from the east, west, and south, the group, composed of elements of the 4th and 124th Infantry Regiments reinforced, infiltrated the base of Lunga Ridge, known to them as Mukadegata, Centipede Hill. A thin line of 1st Raiders and remnants of the 1st Parachute Battalion manned the hill, with the 105mm artillery of the 5th Battalion, 11th Marines, supporting. The 511th's communication line was connected to the Raiders' line, with a direct connection to the 11th Marines forward observer. At this time, the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, held the area west of the Tanaru River, while K Company, 3/1, was on outpost duty adjacent to the overland trail. The 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, was dug in at the coast, with minute patrols extending out to 3/1. Gaps existed here and there, though in time the engineers would plug one breach with elements of the 5th Marines as backup. Because General Vandegrift had recently moved his command post and occupied an area not too far from the ridge, to protect him, the .30 caliber machine guns were temporarily removed from one of the 6 tanks of Company B, 1st Tank Battalion, and repositioned in the event of an enemy breakthrough. The evening of the 12th of September was pitch black, reducing visibility for both the attackers and defenders. The assault forces were not entirely sure where they were heading as they trampled noisily through the darkness, thus losing any tactical surprise. The parachutists were positioned on the left, with the raiders, less Company A, dug in the central portion of the ridge. One company of the 1st Engineers held a line through the jungle to the Lunga River, with Raider Companies A and C on the right. The right flank of the Company A raiders abutted the Lunga. The 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, under Captain Joseph J. Dudkowski, formed a reserve line northeast and southwest across Hill 2, and Company C of the Parachute Battalion was on the left flank, in the draw between Hills 1 and 2, in the vicinity of the ridge, about 50 yards east of the trail. Sections of the 1st Pioneer Battalion were established on both banks of the Lunga River. The 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, under Lieutenant Colonel William N. McKelvey, Jr., defended the eastern perimeter, spanning 3,400 yards north to south, from a point 1,500 yards south of the slow-winding ILU River and ending due east of the crest. Company L, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, covered the left flank with Company K, 3/5, on the right, and Company 1 of the 5th Marines concentrated in the middle. To provide more firepower, 3 machine gun platoons were added to each company. The weapons platoon sighted its 60mm mortars to blanket the grassy plain with fire. The 81mm weapons of Company K, fixed farther back, were also set to zero in on the plain where the enemy was expected. Late that evening, at about 21:30, 4 enemy cruisers launched an intense bombardment on the perimeter, but none of their shells reached the positions on the ridge, splattering instead within the jungle. The 3-day attack actually began at about 2200 on the 12th of September, when the Japanese spilled out from their cover. The 1st Battalion, 124th Infantry, with about 990 soldiers, backed by the 124th's 3rd Battalion, 3/124I, jabbed the far right edge of the Marines' position, clashing with the Company C raiders. Nearly all of Company C was holding the jungle line between the Lunga River and the lagoon at the base of the ridge. At the same time, the cannoneers of the 11th Marines fired. Silence followed for a few minutes while the attackers moved ahead to a position about 200 yards in front of the 11th's forward observer. Alerted to the proximity of the enemy, Colonel Edson gave the command to fire at the exact moment the Japanese troops bolted out of the underbrush heading for the ridge and Edson's command post northwest of Hill 2. Earlier, at 2000, a dozen soldiers had managed to infiltrate between Hills 1 and 2, which caused Edson to move his command post 20 yards behind the forward line. The Paramarine's command post was 20 yards behind Edson's. During the battle that night, Platoon Sergeant Lawrence H. Pappy Holdren, a machine gun commander, bravely stood his ground while surrounded by the enemy after the other units had pulled back. His continued fighting gained time for the raiders to form a new line. He would be awarded the Navy Cross for his deed. A second battery of Marine 105mm howitzers was shifted from the west to the south, and a third battery was then moved into position to support the defenders. The 105S of the 5th Battalion, 11th Marines, under Lieutenant Colonel Eugene Hayden Price, were elevated high, firing by map reference or simply guided by the uproar of the advancing Japanese. If the Marines heard cries from beyond the ridge, they knew their direction had been correct. At 2200, another heavy bolt of fire was dumped on the approaching enemy. That evening, the 511ths, the Raiders and the Chutes fought unrestrained, with both sides severely blooded. In the hands of the skilled Marines, the hand grenade dominated the battle. That late night and early morning hours of the 13th, they fought off 5 attacks involving hours of hand-to-hand combat. With General Kawaguchi's troops at the doorstep, M.G. Robert Manning of Company B, 1st Parachute Battalion, recipient of the Navy Cross for Gavutu, commanded a 60mm mortar squad between Hills 1 and 2. The enemy infantry was stabbing at the middle and left flank in an intense rush, aided by green overhead flares. Gunner Manning organized his men to fire the 60mm tubes at remarkable speed, which helped break the back of the assault. The Marines were forced to pull back to Hill 2, with Para-Marine Sergeant Keith Perkins of Company A, 11th Marines, positioning his machine gun to cover the withdrawal while he was protected by a handful of raiders. Later, his body was found with dozens of enemy dead nearby. Another machine gunner reported firing 25,000 rounds that first night. By this time, the enemy was hitting the front sector and both flanks. Colonel Edson had been attempting a regrouping, but when he could not locate Para-Marine Major Charles A. Miller, he grabbed Captain Harry L. Torgerson, another parachutist and the expert cave sealer on Gavutu. Edson ordered Torgerson to prepare a counterpunch against the threatened left flank. Torgerson gathered enough Para-Marines and raiders to form 2 composite companies and personally led them to firm up the endangered area. The Shoots were able to defend the position and, amidst the confusion, repel the infiltrators in close-quarter fighting, some of the fiercest of the night. Many on both sides were struck down. While the Americans were falling back to an imaginary second line, they were rallied and took up new positions. The line waved and was bent. The Special Weapons Battery, 11th Marines, was overrun, but it regrouped and re-established positions between the division command post and that of the artillery and prepared to hold. The Japanese charged up the ridge, throwing grenades and using 50 mm mortars effectively. The Para-Marines suffered casualties, as did the raiders and a few members of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, that were fed into the line. Those positions were overrun several times, yet the ridge held, and the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, was shifted to a position far to the left. The attack of the Japanese right wing, the Kuma Battalion, under Major A.G. Mizuno, the Ichiki rear echelon, began on the evening of the 13th of September. It was led by the headquarters unit, followed by 177 men of the 1st Company under 2nd Lieutenant Kiyoshi Sato, and 169 men of the 2nd Company under 2nd Lieutenant Toshio Hanehara of the 28th Infantry. Also from the 28th Infantry was the machine gun platoon, commanded by WO-1 Kosaku Nakeo. The reserve unit, the 28th Regimental Anti-Tank Company under 1st Lieutenant Yoshio Okubo, would be located adjacent to the west bank of the Higashikawa River, the Tanaru. They hit a position well secured with barbed wire at the south bank of Alligator Creek, manned by Company K, 1st Marines. As they attempted to breach the wire, every weapon in the Company K, 1st Marines, arsenal fired at the attackers. Most were killed within minutes. 1st Lieutenant Shotaro Maruo, commanding officer of 1st Company, 124th Infantry, described the attack on the ridge. By the 12th, we had marched 5 kilometers during the morning and were 4 kilometers from the enemy lines. We were much encouraged when 26 planes of our Air Force attacked the airfield. At 0400 we advanced, and at 1100 we took out an enemy lookout post. Within the next hour, 2 of our planes were shot down by enemy anti-aircraft fire. In the meantime, one of our planes dropped a bomb in the midst of the 1st Company, 124Y, 1st Lieutenant Shotaro Komatsu, killing 1 and wounding 4. It was meant for the Americans. At 14:30, we reached a point near the position where preparations for the attack were being made. Major Kokusho assembled all the company commanders with our attack orders. 2nd Lieutenant Kobayashi and 4 men left on a scouting patrol of the enemy lines. As soon as dusk fell, we began our march along the Higashikawa River, Tanaru, with the 2nd Company now in the lead, followed by the 4th and the 3rd, and moved across the river. We approached to about 2 kilometers from the enemy's front lines and received heavy gunfire. The 3rd Company was the battalion reserve, and it moved to the rear. 0100 and 0200 had passed, and we still had not obtained our goal, and we had no knowledge of the terrain or the enemy position. The 2nd Company opened the attack, but was stalled. In the early morning, the battalion commander, Major Yukichi Kokusho, withdrew all the companies and planned to regroup and attack again. As dawn drew near, the enemy planes attacked and provided intense bombing and strafing. Major Kokusho gave a spirited talk stating that this was a difficult operation and we must sacrifice our lives to serve our emperor and our country. The second attack started at 1400 with the 4th Company in the lead and hit the enemy's barbed wire and captured a position there. The battalion concentrated at this point but received intense enemy artillery fire from the 11th Marines. The companies scattered and casualties mounted. According to PFC Heister Sakamoto, an ammo carrier with the 3rd Battalion Machine Gun Company, 124th Infantry, under Captain Kichita Hatanaka, his unit cut through the jungle to a point southwest of the airfield and attacked from there while the 2nd and 3rd Battalions came from the south and the Kuma Battalion from the west. Just before 1900 on the 13th, Colonel Oka's West Wing, then numbering just under 1,000 men, was in place to make its move. Sup. Purchased Kiyoshi Sonoda's Anti-Tank Company, 124th Infantry, a segment of the central body of the force, recorded that his unit had 150 men plus 2 platoons with 2 37mm anti-tank guns. The guns were seldom used for fear of attacks by the Marine artillery fire. In fact, in the attack, the weapons were actually hidden, as everyone expected a quick victory, and that there would be no need for fire support. Later, the guns were used for harassing effect. 2nd Lieutenant Kashi, the intelligence officer of the 124th Infantry, recorded in his diary. 2030 arrived at an outpost on the eastern side of HYO, meaning Leopard, code name for the hill not too distant from the airfield. At 2100 headquarters, 2/124I, 5th, 6th and 8th Companies, plus the 2nd Battalion Machine Gun Company, 1st Lieutenant Kia, advanced northeast to attack the enemy positions. During the movement, active artillery fire was heard to the east. Involved in the advance were the 124th Infantry Machine Gun Unit, 124th Infantry Signal Unit, 2nd Battalion Light Mortar Unit, and elements of the Naval Landing Party, the 81st and 84th Guard Units. The 1st Battalion occupied Hill 15 and then withdrew. One battalion commander and several men became casualties, and so they were incapable of engaging the enemy. The situation of the 3rd Battalion and the Ioba Detachment, 2/4I, is not known, but the Nakaguma unit withdrew along the Okawa Longa River. There was mortar fire all night. It seems the 2nd Battalion is gradually withdrawing from its advanced positions. When 2nd Lieutenant Kenji Matsumoto contacted battalion headquarters for instructions about the next move, his 1st Company received orders to advance. However, the assault was disorganized and the companies lost contact with each other. In the interim, Matsumoto, with the 10-man command section, captured a position and secured it with the help of Lieutenant Furubayashi's machine gun platoon, a part of the machine gun company of the 3rd Battalion under Captain Kichita Hatanaka. "Meanwhile," wrote Matsumoto, "I was searching for enemy positions. I met the Ioba commander, Colonel Naomasa Nakaguma, Colorado, 4th Infantry, who clued me in on the battle the night before. During the brief lull, Lieutenant Yukitake and 24 others, all wounded, joined me. At 1500, each unit was ordered to withdraw, and we were not ashamed of the way we fought. The only disheartening point was that the enemy employed his firepower so well." PFC Hiroshi Iwamoto, a rifleman with the 3rd Battalion, 124th Infantry, reported that about 2/3 of his battalion was destroyed in the attack, with the remaining men attached to the other 2 battalions. Matsumoto reported other losses. The battalion commander Kokusho was killed, along with 5 other officers. 180 men were KIA and 100 more wounded and were litter cases. There were many men who were hit yet still able to walk. The return trip was exhausting. It took us 3 days to a point 10 kilometers up the Okawa River. In his account of the retreat, Private First Class Sakamoto noted in his diary that the 3rd Battalion took 10 days to reach the Boneji River basin. An unknown diarist from the Guard Company, 35th Brigade, wrote, 12 September. Finally, tonight at 2000, there was a general attack. The soldiers were tense and winding through the jungle advanced toward their objective. By marching day and night, crossing many steep mountains, we neared the enemy positions. En route communications were cut, and at this point dawn broke. With the loud cannon's roar and tracer bullets, the time for the engagement arrived. The 1st and 3rd Aoba battalions of the frontline force attacked at night, but because of preparations being lacking, it ended regrettably in failure. 13 September. This morning the Booty Guard Company first retreated and then made preparations to attack. Since morning, enemy planes droned overhead all day in formations of 7. A shell burst near me, but I was not scratched. At about 10:30, our planes came over and aerial combat took place for about 30 minutes. Last night's attack ended in failure. Tonight, we are waiting in the jungle to prepare for another attack. At 13 o'clock, each frontline butai settled in position for the attack. Detachment headquarters started action at 16 o'clock, 22 o'clock Guadalcanal time. I climbed a grass-covered hill and observed the situation of the frontline butai. Tonight's general attack was severe. The concentration fire from the enemy's heavy artillery lasted from evening to the following morning and continuously showered us with several hundred shells. During that time, our machine guns and the shouts of our men attacking could be heard. However, our forces bravely rushed into the enemy's front line and inflicted many casualties. It ended up in failure, and the necessity of retreating was regrettable. The butai retreated west along the Lunga River. Therefore, the Guard Company and the 15th Independent Engineer Regiment, in order to open a path by cutting the jungle trees, departed at 9:30, advanced 2 kilometers, and bivouacked. Private Yamame Yutaku of 1st Lieutenant Kakuro Wada's 28th Regimental Gun Company reported, "Only 70 men of the Ichiki detachment survived this attack. Most of the 1st Battalion of the Oka unit was also destroyed. Following their defeat, they started out through the mountains, heading for the coast west of the airport. They only had 3 days' rations when they went into the attack and soon ran out. 4 days later, they pulled their cannons over the trails, but had to give up and bury them. Type 41 75mm mountain guns. It took around 2 weeks to make the trip, and over half the men became sick and died on the way. Only a few men of the Ichiki unit reached the coast. These were attached to the 2nd Division as a labor unit for unloading ships. On the American side, all the Marines on that ridge were heroes. Colonel Merritt A. Edson was first in that group, verifying one of his axioms of command, lead by example. The same could be said for Major Kenneth D. Bailey, Major John B. Sweeney, who commanded Company D, 1st Raiders, Major Houston, Tex Stiff, who played a major role in the Raiders' mortar and weapons platoon, T.S. Sergeant Francis E. Pettus of the Raiders' intelligence section, Captain Harry Torgerson, who rallied the parachutists, and Captain Richard S. Johnson, who commanded one of the paramarine companies on the Knoll. On 13 and the 14th of September, when communication lines were cut, Ciplara, Walter J. Burak, Colonel Edson's runner, was busy quickly carrying messages, dodging bullets, and jumping in gun pits to deliver orders. Others from the rear, cooks, mailmen, radiomen, paper pushers, all rushed to help. Calls continually were heard for more grenades, more ammo. Grenades were used by the hundreds. At daybreak on the 14th, the assault was partially broken off. Bodies lay scattered around the ridge. The attackers were heavily bloodied. In the area alone, covered by the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, 200 enemy were killed. In all, an estimated 1,000 Japanese were killed in action, and an untold number died during the retreat. Following a report that the enemy was in front of the 1st Marines sector, 6 M3 Stuarts from Company B, 1st Tank Battalion, were summoned to investigate. As they approached the site, the 437mm anti-tank guns of 1st Lieutenant Yoshio Okubo's 28th Regimental Anti-Tank Company were in place to deliver fire from a distance of approximately 1,600 feet. This surprise smashed Tank H1. Tank H4 was soon hit and toppled down a steep embankment into the Tanaru River. The headquarters tank was also disabled. In the action, a total of 8 members of Company B were killed. As events transpired, the Marines' lines were infiltrated. 18-year-old CPL Carlo Fulgenzi of the headquarters, 1st Engineers Battalion, was positioned across a jeep track near the division command post, overseeing wounded comrades. He had left the sector to check the ridge line when suddenly he heard a disturbance. He encountered 5 Japanese within minutes of each other. He shot all 5 as he successively came upon them. The Japanese, however, had captured 2 Marines and were torturing them. Their horrific screams penetrated the ridge for hours. At this same time, Pursuit Harry Dunn, a member of Company B, 1st Marines, was involved in a fight in which 24 of his comrades were killed. Dunn was reported as missing in action. However, he showed up a week later, totally exhausted from having carried a wounded comrade to safety. According to Sergeant Shohei Haga, the 2nd Battalion, 4th Infantry, became the second wave of Japanese. The second's orders were to follow 1st Lieutenant Tetsuji Ishibashi's 7th Company and 1st Lieutenant Yoshimi Onodera's 5th Company, and, after passing through those units, to penetrate the enemy's position. At dawn, the 2nd Battalion reached Henderson Field, but had no time to regroup as the Marines counter-attacked from the southern edge of the ridge. Ordered to advance and conduct a frontal attack, the Japanese made a hurried dash in the black of the night. The effort failed, and the Japanese soldiers had no choice but to leave their dead and return to the jungle's edge. The 3rd Battalion, 4th Infantry, under Captain Mori Sasaki, also was to participate in the attack by being barged to the Matanikau River from Kamimbo Bay. But the Cactus Air Force had destroyed so many barges that Sasaki could not get his disorganized battalion in place to help in the offensive, and he remained inactive. Late on the 14th of September, what was left of the attackers' shredded units began to forge their way back west through the jungle to the Matanikau River and temporary sanctuary. It was a diminished force. The 1st Marine Division sent low-flying P-400 SS of the Cactus Air Force to strafe them in the area where the attack from the previous night had originated. The 2 Raider doctors, Lieutenant Cedar Edward P. McClarney and his assistant Lieutenant Robert Skinner, were busy men. Before they could establish a proper aid station, they were inundated with casualties. In an emergency clearing site set up behind the ridge, they skillfully treated more than 200 wounded Marines. Many paramarines and raiders owe their lives to the medical handiwork of the doctors and the U.S. Navy corpsmen. Martin Clemens estimated that the Americans had crossed the Matanikau 76 times during the battle. The paramarines had already been worn out and thinned in ranks by the time the battalion moved from Tulagi to Guadalcanal at the end of August. When the battle was over, 37 raiders had been killed and 103 wounded. Only 85 paramarines were able to stand. Their heretofore decimated battalion had sustained a further 32 killed. Among their 101 wounded were Capts, John E. Gorman, Victor S. Malinowski, and Norman R. Nickerson. The 5th Marines lost 5 killed and 55 wounded. Losses in the 1st Marine Regiment totaled 31 killed or wounded. Colonel Edson and Raider Major Kenneth D. Bailey, who had rallied the Leathernecks on what was now called Bloody Ridge, were awarded the Medal of Honor, though Ken Bailey would not live to receive it. The dead were buried in Guadalcanal's military cemetery, enlisted men and officers side by side. Raider Major Robert S. Brown was interred near Raider PFCs Herman F. Arnold and Jimmy W. Corzine and Sergeant Daniel W. Hudspeth. All would be awarded the U.S. Navy's second highest decoration, the Navy Cross. History would note well the service of Colonel Edson and his defenders of the ridge, but they could have ended up as forgotten dead if not for the cannoneers of the 11th Marines, whose 105 mm howitzers had pumped 1,992 shells into the midst of the assaulting Japanese. The Marines push back. On the 13th of September, the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, had been alerted for transfer from Tulagi to Guadalcanal as reinforcements, and on the 14th it had headed for the transports. At 7:30, Company 1 departed for Guadalcanal by YP boat, and by 9 o'clock the second echelon, all of Company L and the balance of Company 1, was aboard the Bellatrix. By 16 o'clock, the Bellatrix left the dock for the journey to Lunga Roads. The remainder of the battalion, part of Company K, was shifted to Gavutu. On reaching Guadalcanal, the 3 halves, acting as the division reserve, was moved into line on the friendly side of the Matanikau River. The battalion occupied the beach defence position from Lunga Lagoon to Alligator Creek, not exactly a quiet spot for the 2nd Marines. While they remained as the division reserve, they witnessed action when Japanese snipers tried to infiltrate. On the 17th of September, Japanese Imperial General Headquarters ordered the 7th Heavy Field Artillery Regiment under Colonel K. Shimpto, then in Manchuria, to select one company with 4 105mm cannons and prepare it for transfer to the area north of Australia, i.e. New Guinea. The company was to move out within 12 hours, an exacting task. The 2nd Company, under the command of First Lieutenant Akio Tani, IJA, was selected. However, due to the shortage of transportation, it did not deploy for 10 days. The Tani Company, finally reached Rabaul on the 2nd of October, but there the company was reassigned to the 17th Army and was not shipped to New Guinea. It was destined to play a more demanding role on Guadalcanal, where Lieutenant Tani would soon come to be known as the infamous Pistol Pete. On the 18th of September, the Samoa-based 7th Marines, 4,262 strong, landed on Guadalcanal amidst much rejoicing, though the celebration was not so much from seeing the reinforcements as from the food and equipment they brought. With the division strengthened, headquarters had plans for westward expansion, and General Vandergrift had fresh troops to bolster his defences and extend his protective screen. The arrival of the 7th Marines enabled Vandergrift to plan a strong defence sector by dividing the Longa area into 10 zones. Defences of the 7 inland sectors on the west, east and south were buttressed by the addition of infantry battalions. The 3rd Defence Battalion, with the 1st Special Weapons Battalion attached, would continue to be responsible for beach and anti-aircraft protection. Downed Japanese airmen would attest to their accuracy. Although some sectors could not be conclusively held, there were no large exposed flanks, only small gaps here and there. Yet the inland area still presented problems. Key positions on open ridges were organised in depth, but on the lower ground the solid jungle prevented the creation of mutually supporting positions. Nevertheless, outposts were maintained and manned on a 24-hour basis, though not enough leathernecks were available to carry out the huge task of clearing fields of fire for 14,000 yards of jungle, nearly 8 miles. Whenever possible, the controlling line of resistance followed the ridges and sloping valleys. The Samoa Marines had brought enough barbed wire to wire up the front behind 2 ensembles of double-apron fence backed by trip wires between the bands. The cannoneers of the 11th Marines' 75mm pack howitzer battalions remained in positions spread within the perimeter to furnish fire to any threatened sector. Although this defensive design was far from ideal, it provided potent firepower and presented a nearly continuous line to prevent possible enemy penetration. The Americans held a line that stretched along the beach from a point halfway between the Matanikau and the Lunga rivers, east to the ILU River, a distance of some 5 miles. From there its perimeter looped around inland, south and then west, then north to the beach, thus completing an oblong-shaped defensive area along the Lunga River, about 3 miles across at its widest north-south axis. The leathernecks also held a prominent column some 2.5 miles long and 3/4 of a mile wide, extending west along the beach to the Matanikau. The 1st Marine Division was ready to take the offensive. After the engagement at Bloody Ridge, headquarters knew that a major enemy force was operating west of the Matanikau, in Kokumbona, and active in the Mount Austin sector. Miller's Guadalcanal. The first offensive describes the terrain that dominated the area. Mount Austin, a spur of Guadalcanal's main mountain range, juts northward between the Matanikau and Lunga rivers toward Lunga Point, and provided the enemy with an excellent observation post from which to survey activity at Lunga Point, traffic at Henderson Field and the fighter strips, unloading of ships and troop movements. From the hill they could see the American areas west of the Matanikau, and over the hills west of the mountain into Kokumbona, 9,000 yards to the northwest. Mount Austin, where the Japanese were to make their strongest defensive effort of the campaign, is not a single peak, but the apex of a confusing series of steep, rocky, jungled ridges. The main ridge forming the summit rises abruptly out of the foothills about 2 miles south of the shore and east of the Matanikau River. Hill 27, a separate rocky mound, 920 feet high, lies southwest of the summit. Hill 31, a grassy area about 750 yards north of Hill 27, overlooks Lunga Point. What General Vandergrift did not know, however, was that the Japanese were far stronger than his staff had anticipated. The Tokyo Express had shuttled troops from Rabaul to Buin to Guadalcanal, and the U.S. Navy had not been on hand to intercept the sea caravan. Although the Cactus Air Force pilots had managed to annoy the fast Japanese destroyers, they still moved freely down the slot at night to Guadalcanal. On the other hand, although the Imperial Navy could unload its forces in record time, it simply could not provide them with sufficient supplies, a problem that eventually would be the undoing of the Emperor's troops. The soldiers in the Matanikau Kokumbona area were from Colonel Naomasa Nakaguma's 4th Infantry Regiment. Conceivably, the enemy could offer no immediate threat to the south and east sectors, and thus General Vandergrift planned to clear them from the west by a series of thrusts of regimental strength. Once the Japanese had been driven out, the division would be able to establish strong defensive positions to keep them beyond striking distance of Henderson Field. The plan called for operations in the west by elements of the 7th Marines and the 1st Raider Battalion. Lieutenant Colonel Louis B. Chesty Puller commanded the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, and the Raiders were led by Lieutenant Colonel Samuel B. Griffith II. In the meantime, an urgent call had been sent to CUB-1 on Espiritu Santo, seeking radio operators to be shipped to Guadalcanal ASAP. On the 21st of September, 5 CUB-1 radiomen, Lewis Stark, James Smith, Leon Woodward, Keith Upton, and Frank Rathke, were taken off waiting destroyer transports and rushed to Santo's Bomber 1 base for transport to Guadalcanal via Colonel Laverne G. Saunders's Blondie bombers of the 11th Bomb Group. Each flew alone in one of the 5 B-17S during the 2.5-hour flight to Henderson. These men were the team that would run 2nd Lieutenant Sandy Hunt's NGK radio. On the 21st of September, Colonel Edson took command of the 5th Marines, replacing Colonel Leroy P. Hunt. Edson immediately began planning a move to check the Japanese in the west. 2 days later, he ordered Colonel Puller's 7th Marines to proceed southwest to Mount Austin, move west along its northern slopes, and then cross the Matanikau inland to patrol the expanse between the river and Kokumbona. On the 22nd, while Puller's Leathernecks were searching for the enemy, the Japanese moved into a small cave on Mount Austin that permitted a clear view of the airstrip. The Marines had little intelligence beyond what their patrols had discovered in the past few weeks, and thus they continued to act without the benefit of adequate information. One company ran into Japanese guarding the Naikuro Road water supply point. It attacked the patrol commanded by Lieutenant Ohima, but was driven back. Part of Colonel Puller's force also had confronted Japanese on the right bank of the Lunga River. The 124th Infantry's outposts named HYO, Leopard, Toro, Tiger, and Kuma, Bear, were attacked, but the defenders did not weaken, and their strong counter-thrust pushed the Americans aside. On the next day, a Marine patrol reached the Mount Austin area, surprising and scattering a Japanese force. Colonel Edson, meanwhile, had ordered Lieutenant Colonel Walter Reeves, the new commander of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, to reinforce the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines in the west. Reeves's battalion arrived early the following morning. In this sector, the Japanese would put up a stubborn resistance and concede but a few yards of ground. The 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, attacked across the river with Captain Harry Connor's Company E in the lead, but it was beaten back. The Marines ran into a veritable stone wall where the Japanese were protecting their primary river crossing. The 124th Infantry Headquarters was only some 550 yards to the east, and was supported by elements of 1st Lieutenant Shingo Shimokawa's 7th Company, 124th Infantry. Connor's Company E sought protection of the jungle, while Captain Harold Thomas A. Richmond's Company G attacked. The lead platoon under 2nd Lieutenant Paul Moore Jr. attempted to cross about 300 yards from the mouth of the Matanikau River, but it was too deep and casualties were taken. Another attempt slightly upstream was made to ford the watercourse. As they reached the western side, one man was shot in the face but was alive. Lieutenant Moore rescued him while under constant fire and returned to the eastern side. In all, Company G took 25 casualties. Meanwhile, on the 26th of September, Colonel Puller, 1/7th, had been ordered to abort his circuit. He did not cross the river, but turned north along the east bank to the river mouth, where he intended to ford. When his troops reached the mouth, they moved across the sandbar. Heavy fire from the opposite bank greeted the formation, and they were forced back under the intense mortar barrages. Puller's battalion had encountered 1st Lieutenant Taniguchi's 6th Company, 124th Infantry, and 1st Lieutenant Yoshibe Nagao's 124th Regimental Gun Company, with elements of the 4th Infantry. The Marines attacked at 1100 on the right bank, a short distance away from the secondary river crossing, where they were engaged by 1st Lieutenant Takabumi Kojima's 9th Company, 124th Infantry. The Marines would later call this flowing stream the River of Death. The Japanese could well have named it the same. The Leathernecks were not without firepower. The 5th Battalion, 11th Marines, under Lieutenant Colonel Eugene Price, had supported the drive and had some moderate success with spotting by an observing infantry officer. By the 27th of September, the 2nd Battalion, 11th Marines, was also involved. Before the push was over, the guns of the 11th Marines had deposited on the enemy positions in the riverbed area 940 75mm pack howitzer rounds and 300 4100 5mm shells. In the engagement, the second in command of 1st Lieutenant Takabumi Kojima's 9th Company was killed, and Kojima was mortally wounded. Elements of the 124th Infantry were defending the A1 log footbridge that was a key crossing point on the Matanikau. They reported killing 5 Americans and wounding 10 in a firefight when the Marines had attempted to cross. The Japanese controlled the ground and had the upper hand in the engagements. At the secondary river crossing, another well-guarded ford, the area was solidly defended by the 8th Company under 1st Lieutenant Masayuki Kamei and components of the 12th Company, 124th Infantry, under Captain Gensuke Bito. Colonel Puller radioed the 11th Marines for artillery support, but the fire failed to dislodge the strongly entrenched Japanese in their well-prepared positions. They simply brought up more mortars and automatic weapons to stiffen the sights. At about this same time, the 1st Raiders under Lieutenant Colonel Sam Griffith, along with Salea, one of Martin Clemens's scouts, were to proceed west along the coast road to establish a temporary patrol base at Kokumbona, where the route crossed several inland native trails. The sector was deep in Japanese country, and control of Kokumbona would not only deny the enemy good landing beach, but also prevent them from using the track to move inland. The 1st Raiders probed the primary Japanese bridge crossing where 2nd Lieutenant To and his 3rd Independent Trench Mortar Battalion Company, plus 2 attached machine gun units, Lieutenant Nakashima's 2nd Platoon and Lieutenant Moita's 3rd Platoon, were entrenched. In the skirmish, the Raiders' executive officer, Major Kenneth D. Bailey, was killed, and Colonel Griffith was wounded. The Raiders shifted positions, seeking safety, but were still pounded by the 3rd Independent Trench Mortar Battalion's fire. Casualties had mounted without the Marines making a dent in the enemy's position. 3 of Chesty Puller's companies, A, B, and D, were assigned to escort the wounded back to the perimeter. The balance of Puller's troops edged slowly toward the Matanikau River, reaching it the following day. On the 27th, the division ordered the Raiders to join forces with Puller's unit and attack west the next day. Colonel Edson was assigned to command the force, with Colonel Puller as his second. Edson ordered the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, to attack west across the river mouth, but they were hurled back. Upstream about 2,000 yards, the Raiders moved inland to cross the Matanikau. Both forces moved to attack again in the morning, but failed to gain any ground. The Raiders and 2/5ths were facing 1st Lieutenant Makoto Hirota's 5th Company, 124th Infantry, with the company's machine gun unit attached. But while 2/5 was having difficulty installing itself on the west bank, the raiders had advanced to the high ground on Hill 67, Saru Monkey, on the east bank, about 1,500 yards south of the beach. There, however, they were held up by unexpected fire. During the previous evenings, Japanese forces under Major Masuro Tamura's 2nd Battalion, 4th Infantry, and elements of the 2nd Battalion, 124th Infantry, had crossed upstream to the east bank and occupied Hill 65, about 850 yards south of Hill 67. The raiders quickly dispatched a message to Edson that they had a problem, but due to bad reception, the communication was distorted and misconstrued. Colonel Edson mistakenly thought that Griffith's men had crossed the river and were encountering resistance in Matanikau village. He thus decided on a new plan, calling for a 3-battalion attack using the 1st Raiders along with the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, and the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines.